Now, when we're talking about, let's just say the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, so the 13th, 14th, 15th century in North America. This is long before the printed press. This is long before the steam train. This is long before the newspaper. This is long before the internet. This is long before radio. This is long before television. So in order for these legends and these stories to begin to be incorporated into these tribes of indigenous people that are located geographically isolated, let's say, along North America and Canada, that would tend to lead to the belief that there's more credence to this, because more than one story exists in isolated pockets of North America and Canada well before the inventions that brought everybody together, correct? Am
Certainly.
I correct in the assumption? Yeah.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about it, and now again, the reason we have to point to the European contact is because that's when they do first get externalized in terms of they're being written down by the people who brought the written word with them and were encountering these stories for the first time. Undoubtedly, they're much older than that, but
that's generally the starting point for the knowledge of what we know about North America.
Certainly. I mean, we'd have to assume that the stories stretch back at least, some degree in time prior to that. But what's really interesting is that in almost all of those accounts, they're spoken about as contemporaries. So they're not like deities that occupy some place in a creation story or like some cosmogonic origin story that, we came from, very often in those sort of like myths or proto myths, you'll have these creation figures that are just a single entity, like a single character, let's say Zeus or Odin or something like that.
Right.
When you read a lot of, the stories, again, oral tradition, folklore, that sort of database of accrued experiences and observations, they talk about them as, a race, a tribe, like there's multiple things out there, and that they could be encountered at any time if you were to go into these places, that they would typically develop like a strong avoidance taboo about, like, we don't go in those places at certain times because these things are there. So it's gotten kind of bastardized, where I think a lot of people think that in the indigenous stories, they are some sort of like part of the creation myth, like a Zeus or an Odin, etc. And it doesn't seem to be the case. They are described as contemporaries on the landscape in the same way that bears, elk, etc. are.
Now, that being said, where they at? Because fortunately it's taken some longer than other mountain gorillas, the Siberian tigers. It's taken generations of people to find them and document them. Nothing there. So how do you explain that? And how do you explain that, Matt, if it's just a forest creature?
Certainly. Well, therein lies the rub, right? Because again, it's either, to me, like one of these two props, it's either the production of the human mind or it's some living species. I don't really see any intermediary state that they could occupy. There couldn't be something that's like half thought and half alive, that has weight and mass and voids scat and sheds hair and, eats roadkill and things of that nature. So it really depends on, the level of analysis in a lot of ways, because paradoxically, I think most people, especially proponents, when they think of the Sasquatch, they kind of superimpose in their minds a map of North America over 250 years, which is just littered. It's littered with sighting dots, right?
Of course. Well, the ones you see on the internet all the time, the ones that are very familiar, right? You're exactly right.
Yeah. And so on one level, you think, oh, they're everywhere, and then if you were to zoom in any place and time, like, if we picked one drainage, let's say in the Adirondacks
over the last 400 years,
and how many sightings are there? Or if we spend a month in that drainage, will we see one? So it's like, paradoxically, they're everywhere and they're nowhere, right? And so there are these challenges, I think, because again, myself, I'm trying to test that hypothesis. I do think that the biological solution is the more parsimonious of the two. Again, production of the human mind, biological species. I think the biological species requires less complexity to be a sufficient explanatory mechanism.
So let me pause you with just